I spent more than 20 years standing in that kitchen, cooking for the poor, recording every donated dollar, and believing I was doing the right thing.
How
Until
could you
one
sit there
evening,
and
right in
lie
front
to
of the
everyone
entire
here?
community, my
I have the
daughter-in-law stood
evidence
up
right
and
here.
said I was no longer trustworthy. No evidence, no private conversation, just a single sentence, enough to erase a lifetime of honor I had built. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply walked away in silence and began preparing for the moment when the truth would return in a way none of them expected. If you're listening to this story, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe that justice sometimes
I've
arrives
found
quietly,
solace in these
but with
walls
great
for over
depth,
50 years.
please like and subscribe
It's where
so you
I
don't
learned
miss
the
the stories
meaning
that
of
come next.
resilience.
My name is Ruth Bennett. I am 78 years old, and I live in Madison, Wisconsin, a city of long winters, heavy snow, and people who smile at one another as if everyone is kind. I used to believe that, at least until that night. For 22 years, I was the person the church called when it needed a steady hand. I was never good at public speaking, and I never liked standing in the spotlight. I simply worked, quietly, patiently, relentlessly. I knew how to cook a pot of soup large enough for 60 people. I knew where to buy flour that was cheap but still good. I knew which members of the congregation would never ask for help, but still needed a bag of groceries left quietly at their door. I knew Mrs. McCarthy's medication schedule at the nursing home. I knew Mr. Lucas would forget breakfast if no one reminded him. And I knew exactly where every donated dollar went. I did not handle the money in the way people imagine. Sitting on a safe or guarding cash was the record keeper, the one who signed receipts when buying food, who submitted invoices to the church accountant, who crossed off each line in the ledger and kept every receipt in a worn file box with frayed corners. It was like brushing your teeth. No one praises you for it, but without it, the entire system rots. That evening, I walked into the meeting room wearing my ash gray cardigan and carrying my small leather satchel. I arrived early, as always. I straightened the chairs. I set the water pitchers on the table. I even brought a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies because I knew that after meetings, people got hungry, and hunger made them irritable. At my age, you learn a lesson. All big things begin with small ones. The room slowly filled. More than 50 people. Faces I had known my entire life. People who had attended my wedding. People who had come to my husband's funeral. People who had hugged me and said, "Ruth, you're so strong, see," just before turning away to live their own lives. I saw my son, Daniel, sitting in the middle row. He wore a light blue shirt, his hands resting neatly on his thighs, like a man trying very hard to look proper. Beside him sat his wife, Karen Bennett. Karen always appeared like a carefully adjusted photograph. Softly curled hair, a cream-colored dress, heels just high enough to draw attention, but still low enough to say, "I'm modest." She always knew how to make herself look responsible. I expected her to nod at me, the way she always did. But that night, she didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed together, as if preparing to read a verdict. The meeting began as usual. Pastor James Whitaker reviewed the winter charity programs. He mentioned expenses for the community kitchen. He praised a few new volunteers. I listened, took notes, and nodded. The rhythm was so familiar I could predict his sentences before he finished them. Then Karen stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be called on. She rose as if it were her natural right. "Excuse me, everyone," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "I think we need to talk about financial transparency." I felt the air in the room shift instantly. Backs straightened, heads tilted slightly. Before a crowd judges, they all perform the same ritual. They go silent to see who will be thrown down first. Karen continued slowly. "Recently, there have been a few expenses that aren't very clear, and I think in order to protect the church's reputation, we need to re-examine how donated money is being managed." I remained seated, I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, not from fear, but from surprise. A bitter kind of surprise, like opening the refrigerator and realizing someone has eaten the last piece of cake you were saving. Pastor James frowned. Karen, what exactly are you saying? Karen turned slightly and looked directly at me for the first time that evening. Her smile wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the smirk of someone who believes they are doing the right thing. I'll be direct, she said. We've let Mrs. Ruth handle the records for too long, and I've heard some people wondering whether certain funds might be being used improperly. The sentence hit the room like a plate shattering. I heard someone inhale sharply. I heard a chair creak. I heard a pin drop. But what I heard most clearly was the silence afterward, the kind of silence reserved for someone who has just been labeled. I looked at Daniel. My son did not stand up. He did not ask, "What are you talking about?" He did not object. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on some invisible point on the table, like a man who had already decided not to get involved, even if his own mother was being crushed. I understood then. Karen would not have been this confident without Daniel's quiet consent. And in that same moment, I realized something even more bitter. They no longer needed me. They thought I was just an old key, useful until the door was opened, then disposable. Karen opened a folder, but I noticed immediately. There were no invoices, no receipts, just a few printed pages, scattered numbers, the kind of thing meant to feel like evidence without actually proving anything. Here, Karen said, holding them up. Some expenses lack clear descriptions, and I propose that, temporarily, Mrs. Ruth should step back until everything is reviewed. She used the word temporarily like a gift, as if she were granting me mercy. I could have stood up and asked, which expenses? Where are the receipts? Who are these some people? I could have said, had enough documentation to fill an entire cabinet. I could have said every expense carried the treasurer's signature and that I was only the record keeper. But I also knew something deeply human. Once a crowd has been invited to act as a jury, truth is no longer the priority. Moral satisfaction is. And Karen had just handed them that satisfaction. Pastor James looked at me, his expression heavy. He wasn't a bad man. He was simply the kind of man who feared scandal more than injustice. By my age, you meet many like him. Ruth, he said hesitantly, perhaps to avoid gossip. You could take a break for a while. We'll review the records. If there's no problem, everything will be fine. To avoid gossip. I heard those words like scissors cutting straight through the 22 years I had spent in kitchens, storage rooms, and nursing homes. I looked around the room, at the faces I had helped, the people who had eaten my soup, the people who had received food bags I quietly left at their doors. They said nothing. They didn't look at me for long. They looked at Karen instead, as if watching a young woman stand up for transparency. Then I saw Linda Morris, my friend, sitting in the corner. Her hands were clenched together, her lips trembling. She wanted to speak, but she didn't dare. Like the others, she was strapped to the chair of silence. I bent down and neatly closed my ledger. I picked up my leather satchel. I stood. There were no tears, no pleading. I heard Karen exhale softly, as if she had just completed a difficult task, the exhale of someone who believes they have just cleaned up an organization. I walked toward the door, and as I passed the row where Daniel sat, I paused for a single beat. I looked at my son long enough that he had no choice but to look up. His eyes darted away. Quickly, I thought, with a trace of irony, that when he was a boy, he used to be afraid to look me in the eye after breaking the neighbor's window. Now, he was still afraid, only this time, he had broken something much larger. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I opened the door and stepped outside. Cold air slapped my face. Carrying the smell of snow and river wind, the parking lot glowed yellow under streetlights. I walked slowly. My age demanded it. But inside my head, everything was moving fast. The bitterness did not come from being temporarily removed. The bitterness came from the fact that they had done it in front of everyone, as if I were a stain that needed to be wiped away. I sat in my car. I didn't start the engine right away. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, hands that had signed thousands of papers, packed hundreds of gift bags, and washed thousands of dishes. I whispered one sentence, meant only for myself. All right, Karen, go ahead and think I'm ashamed. Then I turned the key. The dashboard lights came on, and for the first time in a very long while, what I felt was no longer sadness. It was clarity. I knew I would not scream. I would not beg for my place back with tears. I would reclaim it using the very things Karen had used to smear me: ledgers, numbers, and the truth. I left the parking lot that night without turning on the radio. I needed to hear the old engine of my car, needed that steady sound to keep my thoughts from drifting too far. When you've lived nearly 80 years, you learn one simple truth. If you let your emotions drive, you'll crash into something. The next morning, I didn't go to church. The Sunday after that, I didn't go either. The week after, my familiar chair in the charity kitchen was still empty. No one stood by the soup pot to remind, stir gently, don't scorch the bottom. No one knocked on the nursing home doors at 9 a.m. with a medication list in hand. I disappeared from the rhythm of the community so quickly that it was almost effortless. And just as I had expected, people found a very convenient explanation. They said I was ashamed. They said I had withdrawn to avoid noise. Some even said, at that age, being questioned once is enough to break a person. Linda told me all this during a short phone call. She spoke softly, as if afraid the walls of my house might be listening. Ruth, they think you couldn't handle it. I was silent for a few seconds, then let out a very quiet laugh. Not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when you hear something absurd and yet painfully accurate about human nature. No, I couldn't bear being publicly humiliated, but I could bear waiting, and I let them believe I had truly collapsed. I didn't write emails. I didn't call the pastor. I didn't ask Linda to speak for me. I didn't explain myself to anyone. At my age, early explanations serve only one purpose. They help other people sleep better. They don't make the truth any brighter. While they whispered behind my back, I began to work. I pulled the old file box out from under the bed, the same box Daniel had once seen and laughed at. Why do you keep all this stuff, Mom? It's exhausting. I remembered my answer clearly. Because human memory fails. Paper doesn't. 22 years lived inside that box. I spread the files across my kitchen table, sorted by year, by month, by type of expense. I worked slowly, carefully, no differently than when I had run the charity kitchen. Every page was smoothed flat, every corner aligned. The first day, I only organized. On the second day, I began to read closely. And by the third day, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine, not from surprise, but from its terrifying familiarity. The expenses Karen had raised concerns about at the meeting were not new. They appeared sporadically over the past 3 years, small, scattered, not large enough to immediately draw attention, but they shared one thing in common. I was not the final approver. I put on my glasses and leaned closer to a printed bank transfer confirmation email. The text was clear, leaving no room for emotion. Sender, Daniel Bennett, my son. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't sigh. I wasn't dizzy. It was simply a very still moment, like finally finding the missing piece of an ugly puzzle. Daniel had never liked bookkeeping. He preferred talking about vision, about opportunity, about cash flow. But in those emails, his tone was different, concise, decisive, and practiced, like someone who hadn't done this just once. Then I saw Karen's name, not as the one asking questions, but as the one giving confirmation. Proceed that way, as long as it's done before the reporting period. Ruth doesn't need to know the details. That last line made me laugh out loud. Ruth doesn't need to know the details. I, the woman who had recorded every donated dollar for 2 decades, had suddenly become someone who didn't need to know. At that moment, I no longer felt indignant. I felt clear. Karen had never suspected me. She knew exactly what was happening, and she also knew that if someone needed to absorb the blame, an elderly woman who had spent years staying quiet, someone like me, was the perfect choice. Old, unloud, few would believe she would fight back. And most importantly, I was Daniel's mother. There is nothing more convenient than a mother when you need a sacrifice. That afternoon, my phone vibrated. The name on the screen, Karen. I watched it ring again and again. On the third call, I answered. Ruth? Karen's voice was noticeably softer. I just wanted to check in. Are you all right? She called me by my name. Not mom, not aunt. Polite, just distant enough to avoid responsibility. I'm fine, I said. Thank you. I know what happened recently wasn't pleasant, Karen continued, her tone filled with carefully rehearsed sympathy. But you understand, everything was done to protect the church. No one wants to make a big deal out of it. Protect the church. I looked at the stack of emails on the table, looked at my son's electronic signature, looked at the numbers that had been transferred so conveniently. I understand, I said. Karen exhaled softly, clearly relieved. That's good. I think if you rest for a while, things will calm down. Rest. A very gentle word for please disappear. Maybe so, I replied. The call ended. I set the phone down, my hand still holding a printed email. And that was the quiet climax of this chapter. Not a confrontation, not a threat, but the moment I knew, with certainty, I was not falsely accused. I was set up. That night, I turned on my old computer, the one Daniel had once offered to replace with a newer one. I hadn't agreed, because this one, I knew every folder in it. I backed up everything, emails, scanned files, edit histories, one by one. I worked slowly, steadily, keeping emotion out of it, the same way I had stirred a large pot of soup for 60 people, not rushed, not heavy-handed, but never forgetting the bottom of the pot. When I placed the last folder into a stiff cardboard binder, I paused and looked at it for a long moment. I whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear, let them think I'm ashamed. Shame is what they're used to using to silence others. And me, I'm used to ledgers. And this time, the ledgers will speak. I didn't return to the church immediately after finishing the data backup. I let a few more days pass, long enough for people to grow accustomed to the idea that Ruth Bennett had truly disappeared. In that quiet stretch, I wrote a very short email, just 3 lines. I sent it to Pastor James Whitaker and the board. To protect the church's reputation and put an end to all doubts, I propose an independent audit with the participation of an external accounting firm and a representative from the diocese. I am fully willing to cooperate. Ruth Bennett. No complaints, not a single line of self-defense. I knew this much. When you are under suspicion, calmness often unsettles people more than protest ever could. The response came quickly. Pastor James called me. His voice was cautious but relieved, like a man who had just been handed a life preserver. Ruth, I think this is a reasonable proposal. Transparency is a good thing. Transparency, when spoken by the exécutif, right people at the right moment, It always sounds virtuous. The audit was scheduled for a Thursday evening, at the same time as the council meeting. The same old room, the same long table where I had sat for 22 years. Except this time, I was no longer the one pouring the water. When I walked into the room, no one applauded. No one looked away either. They watched me the way you watch someone who has returned, but no longer belongs where they once did. I saw Karen immediately. She stood near the whiteboard, speaking quietly with two board members. Cream-colored office dress, notebook in hand, confident posture. A face perfectly suited to the role she was playing. When she noticed me, Karen smiled. Not a victorious smile. The smile of someone who believed she still held the upper ground. "Ruth," she said, her voice just loud enough for others nearby to hear. "It's good that you came. I'm very glad you also want clarity." Also, the word nearly made me laugh, as if I were merely following her lead, while she guided the truth forward. "I've always wanted clarity," I replied. "I just wasn't asked." Karen nodded, as though I had said something emotional rather than factual. Then she turned away, without another question. Daniel sat in the middle row. When I looked at my son, he avoided my eyes, pretending to focus on his phone. I noticed something small but important. He no longer looked as comfortable as he had during the previous meeting. The audit began. 2 external accountants had been invited, a middle-aged man with glasses and a younger woman who spoke little but took notes rapidly. A representative from the diocese sat at the far end of the table, hands resting on a folder marked with an official seal. Karen spoke first. She was smooth. She talked about responsibility, about community trust. She said she wasn't accusing any individual. She simply wanted to ensure everything followed proper procedure. As she spoke, I noticed a few nods around the room. People have always admired those who present themselves as sacrificing for the collective good. Then it was my turn. I didn't stand. I simply opened my small leather satchel, took out a neatly arranged file, and placed it on the table. "I don't have a speech," I said. "I only have data." I slid the file toward the 2 accountants. "These are copies of all ledgers, transfer confirmation emails, and edit histories from the past 3 years. I've marked the expenses the board has questions about." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, like a window being opened on a cold day. The male accountant began turning pages, very slowly. He said nothing, just nodded from time to time. The woman beside him opened her laptop and began cross-checking timestamps. 10 minutes passed. No one spoke. Karen maintained her smile, but I saw her grip tighten around her pen. Then the accountant looked up. "Mrs. Bennett," he asked, "can you confirm this electronic signature?" He turned the laptop toward me. I needed only a second. "That isn't mine," I said. "My signature doesn't use that format, and I don't have final approval authority over these transactions." He nodded. "Correct. This signature belongs to the account of Mr. Daniel Bennett." The room seemed to lose its air. Daniel looked up. His mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. Karen leaned forward. "Wait," she said quickly. "Daniel was only providing technical support. Ruth isn't comfortable with computers, so—" "I'm comfortable enough to know I didn't sign," I interrupted, my voice still even. The accountant continued, without looking at Karen. "All transfer confirmation emails were sent from Mr. Daniel Bennett's account, and there are confirmation replies from Mrs. Karen Bennett's account." Karen's eyes widened for a split second. Then she smiled, again a little stiff. "That was just internal coordination," she said. "We were only trying to help." Help. I thought to myself, she still believed this was a moral discussion. The diocesan representative finally spoke. His voice was low, emotionless. Whether it was help or not will be determined later, but at present, there is a clear issue of authority overreach and concealment of information. Karen turned to me. For the first time, her gaze was no longer steady. "Ruth," she said quietly, "if you had concerns, you could have spoken to us privately. There was no need to make this so public." I looked at her. For a long time. "It was you," I said slowly, "who chose to do this in front of everyone." The smaller climax of this chapter didn't come from shouting. It came from the silence that followed. No one defended Karen. No one looked at Daniel anymore. The nods from earlier were gone. The accountant closed the file. "We'll need more time to complete the report. But one thing is certain," he said. "These expenses were not properly authorized." I gathered my documents, closed my satchel, stood. "I'm not here to reclaim a position," I said. "I'm here so the truth isn't distorted ever again." I looked at Daniel one last time. My son lowered his head. Karen sat motionless. Her smile was completely gone. As I walked out of the room, I knew the trap had closed, and they were the ones who had stepped into it. I didn't return to the table immediately after the first audit. I knew that for people like Karen, partial truth still leaves room to maneuver. And just as I expected, in the days that followed, I heard whispers that she was offering further explanations, clarifying context, trying to turn numbers into technical misunderstandings. I didn't intervene. I waited for the official report. The next meeting took place on a Monday evening. Same room, same long table. But the atmosphere had changed. There were no polite nods, no friendly murmurs. Everyone sat a little straighter than usual, as if sensing that tonight someone would lose their footing. I arrived on time, sat in my old seat. No one asked how I was. No one avoided my eyes either. They looked at me, then looked away quickly, as if afraid of seeing something that would force them to choose a side. The two auditors stood beside the projector. The diocesan representative sat among the board members. Pastor Mariti. James stared down at the papers in front of him, his hands clasped tighter than usual. Karen and Daniel sat next to each other. Karen was still neatly dressed, dark skirt, hair smoothed into place. But there was one small detail I noticed immediately. She hadn't brought a notebook. Only a handbag pressed close to her feet, as if she were afraid someone might touch it. The meeting began. The male auditor stood, his voice even and detached, the voice of someone accustomed to speaking in numbers, not compassion. "All data has been cross-checked," he said. "We will present it in chronological order." The screen behind him lit up. The first line appeared. Transaction list, last 36 months. Numbers streamed downward, steady, cold, repeated withdrawals, not large, but precise in a way that felt deliberate. Each one is spaced a few weeks apart, right on time, right on rhythm. I heard someone inhale softly. The auditor continued. "We compared the timing of these withdrawals with the personal activity schedule of the individual who executed them." The slide changed. Screenshots from social media. Daniel is standing in front of a hotel in San Diego. Daniel is smiling on a beach in Florida. Daniel is in a wine bar in Napa. The dates matched. The withdrawals appeared just before or during those trips. I didn't turn to look at my son. I didn't need to. I knew that feeling, the one where you try to keep your surface calm while something inside you collapses layer by layer. "Next," the female auditor said, "is the email confirmation system." The screen changed again. The recipient address was clear, not the church's general email, not the treasurer's. It was Karen's personal email. The room began to stir, but not loudly. It was the kind of scattered, brittle sound glass makes when it hits the floor. Karen leaned forward. "This isn't the full context," she said quickly. "I only received those emails for tracking purposes." "I didn't?" "You sent confirmation replies," the auditor interrupted politely. "We've highlighted them." A short email appeared on the screen. "Understood. Proceed as planned. Sender, Karen Bennett." Time sent, 11:42 p.m. The room went dead silent. No one was looking at me anymore. All eyes were on the two of them. Daniel lowered his head, his hands clenched together, knuckles turning white. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. I could tell she meant to speak, but her words couldn't keep pace with the speed of the truth. We also reviewed electronic signature access, the auditor continued, and we can confirm that the signature used does not belong to Mrs. Ruth Bennett. A heavy pause settled over the room. Pastor James looked up, for the first time meeting Karen's eyes directly. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. The emotion people who pride themselves on morality fear most. Karen finally shot to her feet. "We were just trying to help," she said, her voice higher than before. "If it weren't for us, those expenses wouldn't have been processed on time. Ruth couldn't keep up with the technology." "Karen," the diocesan representative said calmly, "no one here is discussing technology. We are discussing concealment and overstepping authority." Karen's voice cracked mid-sentence, not into tears, but into the sound of someone who had always controlled the room, suddenly stripped of footing. "We didn't take the money for personal use," she said, her voice weakening. "It was just temporary." Temporary. I thought bitterly. Every wrongdoing likes to dress itself in the word temporary. No one responded to her. No one turned to ask me a single question, and that was the most satisfying moment. Not loud, but profoundly deep. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was doing its work. The auditor concluded, "A full, written report will be submitted." But the preliminary conclusion is this: there were clear violations, coordination, and intentional concealment. Karen dropped back into her chair, her face visibly drained of color. Daniel remained bowed, as if by not looking at anyone he might disappear. I stood up, not to make a speech, just to stand. The entire room turned toward me by instinct. "I didn't come back to prove that I was right," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "I came back because I refused to have my name erased by insinuation." I looked at Karen, then at Daniel. "For 22 years, I continued, I kept everything in order so no one else would have to worry. And that silence made some people believe they could use me as a shield." I stopped. There was nothing more to add. The climax of this chapter wasn't in what I said. It was in the silence that followed. No one defended them. No one questioned me further. There was nowhere left to turn. I picked up my satchel and walked out of the room. Behind me, the room remained silent. And I knew some things, once exposed to the light, can never return to what they were. I didn't go home right away that night. After walking out of the meeting room steeped in silence, I sat in my car for a long time. The parking lot lights cast thin streaks across the windshield. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat there, listening to my heartbeat settle back into a steady rhythm, like a machine that had finally been realigned. At my age, I don't need a loud victory. I need closure. In the days that followed, the news spread quickly, faster than the accusations ever had. Only this time, no one whispered. People spoke in short, dry sentences, the way they do when discussing an accident that has already been confirmed. Daniel resigned from the board. There was no farewell gathering, no speech, just a brief notice posted on the internal bulletin board, neat and impersonal, like cleaning up after a mistake. Karen disappeared from the community. No more cream-colored dresses, no more proper smiles, no public explanation. She left in the sani, one way people who love standing at the center of attention can never endure. Total silence. There were apologies, late ones, and meaningless ones. Daniel called me one rainy afternoon. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. "Mom, I'm sorry." That was all. "No, for hurting you. No, for letting them smear you. Just a hollow apology, like an envelope with no letter inside. I've heard you, I said, but I don't need it. He went quiet on the other end. Maybe he was waiting for me to say more. I didn't. Some apologies exist only to make the speaker feel lighter. I am no longer responsible for carrying anyone else's relief. I didn't return to church right away either. I waited another week, not out of fear, but because I wanted everything to settle on its own. I had spent my entire life making sure important things unfolded in order. I wasn't about to break that habit at the end. The day I returned to the charity kitchen was a cold morning. A thin layer of snow covered the steps. I wore my old gray cardigan, no makeup, no pearl necklace. I didn't come back to win. I came back because this was my life, and no one had the right to erase it. The kitchen door opened. The familiar smell of fried onions and broth rushed out. The sound of spoons hitting pots. The soft hiss of the gas stove. Those small things had been my heartbeat for more than 20 years. No one applauded. No one said, "Welcome back." There were only lowered gazes, short nods. A few people avoided my eyes as if afraid of confronting the silence inside themselves, and that was enough. Linda stood in the corner of the kitchen. Her eyes were red. She didn't say anything. She simply handed me a clean apron. I took it, tied the strings, very slowly. In that moment, I felt a strange kind of satisfaction, not sharp, not hot, but solid, like straightening your back after days of being forced to bow. I began to work. I stirred the soup, tasted it, added salt. No one needed to guide me. No one dared to grant me a new role. I didn't ask for my old position back. I stepped into it, the way someone returns to the kitchen that has always been theirs. Throughout the morning, no one mentioned Karen. No one mentioned Daniel. Their names vanished from small conversations, as if the community had silently agreed. Some people, once they step too far out of line, are no longer spoken of. Around noon, Pastor James stopped by. He stood beside the stainless steel table, hands clasped. His eyes were different now, less cautious, more regretful. "Ruth," he said, "I want to apologize for not protecting you when it mattered." I looked at him for a long time. "I don't need you to protect me," I said. "I need you not to stay silent." He nodded. No excuses. This time, his silence was in the right place. That afternoon, as I was cleaning the kitchen, I heard voices in the hallway. A familiar one, quieter than before. Karen. She didn't come in. She stood outside the glass door. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, then dropped away. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The public humiliation had already happened, not through anything I said, but through where I was standing. That evening, I went home, made tea, and sat by the window. Snow fell steadily. Madison was still cold, but my house was not. I thought about the years behind me, about how silence had once helped keep the peace, and about the cost of that silence. I don't take pleasure in laughter. I take pleasure in standing upright again, exactly where I belong. No need for recognition, no need for more apologies, no need for anyone to return. Some victories don't require a trophy. They only require that you no longer bow your head. And if someone asks me what I learned from all of this, I will answer simply, dignity is not something you ask to have back. It is something that, if you hold on to it long enough, will find its own way home. After everything that happened, I came to understand one thing with absolute clarity. Justice does not always arrive with loud voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, justice comes in silence, when the truth is placed where it belongs, and when those who once believed they had the right to judge and discard others are forced to face the consequences of their own choices. I believe in God, and I believe He does not teach us to endure injustice for the sake of false harmony. He teaches us to preserve our dignity, to remain clear-minded, and to never turn away from the truth, even when that truth makes others uncomfortable. Faith did not make me weaker. Faith gave me clarity to know what is right, and the courage to stand firm when I was pushed to the margins. God did not remove the trials from my life. He gave me the strength to walk through them without losing myself. If you are listening to this story and see a reflection of yourself being doubted, being dismissed, being asked to stay silent so others can live more comfortably, please remember this: you are not wrong for protecting your dignity. You are not selfish for refusing to become a sacrifice for someone else's wrongdoing. If this story touched you, please share it so others know they are not alone. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what this story made you think about. And if you believe that stories about justice, faith, and dignity deserve to be told more often, subscribe to the channel and walk with me through the stories still to come. May God bless all who are listening, granting you peace, clarity, and the strength to stand firmly in your own truth.